Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
So there's a very specific way in which we use these tools that ensures it starts with our humanity and ends with our humanity, and we strategically, intentionally bring in AI along the process.
Allison Shapira is a Harvard lecturer, leadership communication advisor, and the founder and CEO of Global Public Speaking. They work with senior leaders to strengthen executive presence and communicate with clarity and credibility, especially in high-stakes moments. Allison is also the author of AI for the Authentic Leader, which explores how leaders can use AI to support communication and decision-making without losing their authentic voice. In this episode, we talk about the risks of over-relying on AI, how to project confidence without false certainty, and what it takes to build trust in an AI-mediated world. Well, I'm excited to talk with you because there's so much fun stuff in your background. You started as an opera singer, right? And ended up advising some of the world's most powerful leaders on how to communicate. And to me, that trajectory suggests that you understood something early about the relationship between voice, presence, and trust before it became a leadership framework. What was it that you understood?
Well, training to be an opera singer taught me a series of skills that I never thought I would actually use in the professional world. I just thought it would make me really good at karaoke, which it is.
Which it does.
Which it does. I don't like karaoke, but I'm really good at it when I do it. And what I learned once I got my first job outside of the music field, I was working in diplomacy, where all of a sudden I had to write and deliver presentations on behalf of a diplomatic organization and on behalf of a very turbulent time, specifically in the Middle East was when I was doing this work. And I had no idea how to write or deliver a speech, but I knew how to sing and dance on stage. So actually it was through Toastmasters over 20 years ago, that I realized everything I learned as an opera singer, breathing, breath control, being able to project my voice, that sense of stage presence, all of that made me an incredibly powerful speaker and an even better coach of other speakers. Because as opera singers, when we're not speaking, all we're doing is critiquing other speakers. So we developed this very nuanced eye and ear for how the subtle shifts in someone's body, voice, and tone can either reinforce or undermine their words. And I soon realized how powerful those concepts were in the business world, where the way in which you build trust is through ensuring every part of you is communicating the same message so that there isn't a disconnect between your words and your body language. So much of what I learned as a singer actually made me a great executive advisor and public speaker.
That's so fantastic. And so you wrote this book, which just came out recently. You wrote AI for the Authentic Leader. And that comes at a moment when AI it's being used to draft, rehearse, simulate, and polish nearly every form of communication. So what was the leadership problem you kept seeing that made this book feel urgent right now rather than 5 years ago or 5 years from now?
I've been studying AI for about 8 years, ever since app developers started to come to me to test their public speaking apps, and I saw how they were incorporating AI into the tools. And it wasn't until generative AI came out that I thought, what if we could go deeper and use these tools, these AI tools, not just to make us better speakers, but could AI actually make us more authentic leaders? That was the question I set out to solve. And as these AI tools developed, I realized the potential for daily use, both for good and for bad. And the reason I wrote the book was not because my executive clients were asking about AI, but because not enough of them were asking about AI. And I know how closely you follow this and have worked in this field for years. last year, I would ask my clients, how are you using ChatGPT? Are you allowed to use AI tools at work? And my clients, who are mostly Fortune 50 executives in highly regulated industries like banking, would say either, well, we're not allowed to use it at work, or they would say, oh, the tech department is working on it. So they were abdicating the responsibility of learning these tools to the tech team. And I knew how powerful and impactful these tools would be. So I wrote the book as a guide for busy leaders to learn how to use AI in a way that doesn't undermine trust and credibility. And now in 2026, that's all people are talking about. And we're actually starting to see research come out that justifies that underscores that belief, because we're starting to see research studies that show that when leaders over rely on AI for routine communication, their subordinates view them as less confident, less competent, less caring, and start to question their judgment. So the cost of misusing AI is extraordinarily high.
Yeah, there's two follow-up questions I have for you, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to go down first. But I think I want to start with just kind of the word authentic, because the word authentic and authenticity has kind of been used so heavily in leadership contexts that it risks becoming meaningless. So I want to know how you are thinking about it in a way that is technically precise, or, kind of precise to this moment, to this context, especially when the tools that leaders are using to communicate are increasingly synthetic.
That's right. So the focus of my work for 24 years has been based on the premise that authentic communication builds trust, and trust leads people to take action to achieve results. So that's the theory of change that I've worked with. We have to define what authentic means, because sometimes we'll say, well, not that kind of authenticity. I mean, it's not just bring your whole self. Sometimes your whole self is abrasive or lazy. I'm authentically impatient when people waste my time. My father was a New York City cab driver, so I drive like a New York City cab driver. Authentic, yes. Effective, no. So the way in which I define authenticity in a way that's productive in a professional setting is I define authenticity as speaking and acting in alignment with your values, as opposed to controlled by your emotions, which is what happens every time I drive a car. But speaking and acting in alignment with your values is how you tap into a sense of purpose in your work. And when you tap into that sense of purpose around why you do what you do, that's when your authentic voice comes out. And it's not like you have to build it. You have to find it. So the concept that I think about is how do you reclaim your faith in your voice? Because you've covered it up based on either how you were raised, how you were socialized by society, or how you learned to adapt in a professional setting. We cover up our authentic voice because we feel like it's not effective, when actually it's the most effective leadership tool you have in order to build trust. And so I want to give people permission to tap into that authenticity so that they can use it to effectively lead their organization or their team.
So I guess that, building on that point, then, when a when a when a leader uses AI to help them write a speech or prepare for a hard conversation or craft a message to their board, and let's say the output is genuinely better or more effective than they would have written alone, is that building executive presence, or is it quietly eroding it somehow, to the point you raised earlier about, if it's able to be perceived as kind of AI augmented or assisted? So what is happening in the moments when the AI isn't there? Do they still have the skills? How do you see that kind of whole ecosystem?
There's so much to unpack there. And one question I received in a keynote recently was, what happens when you use these AI tools that you're teaching us to bring out our authenticity, and then we show up in person and our AI tools are better at being us than we are?
Right.
Which is an argument in favor of making sure your in-person skills are just as powerful as your offline skills as well. But I'll give you an example of when we might feel like AI makes us better than we are, but it's not. when many of us started to use AI to help us streamline our LinkedIn articles, at first I loved it because AI was making my articles so much more punchy and easier, punchier, easy to read, easy to absorb. And I loved it. And I thought, is this me? No, but it is my message, and it's
Right.
better than what I would write. Then, of course, as you know, within a week, everyone was using the exact same punchy format for their
Right.
LinkedIn posts, and it became inauthentic. So the challenge is when we're relying on these tools and we all start to sound the same. And I believe as AI smooths out our communication, it will be the jagged edges of authenticity that stand out. And the way in which we make that happen is when we make sure that first draft is our language, our voice, and then we strategically bring in AI along the process of writing the message. And I call that the AI authenticity loop, which is in the book and which your listeners and viewers can find on my website at allisonshapira.com/AI. They can download a resource guide that has that authenticity loop. So there's a very specific way in which we use these tools that ensures it starts with our humanity and ends with our humanity. And we strategically, intentionally bring in AI along the process.
Yeah, it's great. I love, there's so much in that, to unpack, as you just said. But I think one of the things that this makes me think about is this tension between what AI tools seem to tend to reward and incentivize and what leadership communication tends to require. And it seems like AI tools are tending to reward, speed and polish and conformity to these kind of best practices, and leadership communication is often about nuance and values, as you said, and sometimes holding deliberate ambiguity in place. And so I'm wondering, how do you help leaders hold that tension without rejecting the tools or losing themselves to what the tools reward?
You're absolutely right, because what I'm seeing is that when I put in a message into an AI tool and it helps make suggestions, what it does is it takes all the vivid language and generalizes it. It's even called the homogeneous effect because of how these language models are trained. So we have to understand what they're doing and then make that executive decision to not utilize those specific recommendations, which is why when I'm working with a leader who wants to bring AI in, we always have to start with our own voice, our own level of our own first draft. An executive client recently was preparing for introductory remarks at her company's annual offsite. And she came to our first coaching session and she said, "I already wrote a draft for you. Let me know what you think." And she gave it to me. And I could tell within 3 seconds that it was generated by ChatGPT or Copilot. And I said, let's set this aside and let's start with my process, which I've been teaching over 20 years, to help you identify what you want to say and bring out your authentic voice. So I ensure they're not skipping that process. What I'm also doing is developing AI tools that use my process that they can then chat with to help them find their voice after our coaching sessions. So one particular tool that I teach is to be able to ask yourself why you before you craft a message, which means, why do you care? When was a moment in your life that made you care about the work you do and the impact you have? Even the most tech heavy or finance heavy fields all have that sense of purpose within a leadership role. And so I created a custom chatbot called Authenticity GPT that teaches leaders the why you question, dialogues with them, and then creates a why you filter that they can copy and paste into whatever AI tool they're allowed to use at work, Copilot, Gemini, and then they can use that to evaluate every corporate message they write to make sure it reflects their values.
I love that. I think, that bringing the values into it is obviously super critical. I'm also thinking about this phenomenon of ambiguity and how it shows up in generated text versus how it shows up in leadership communication, right? Like I'm coming back to that because I feel like there's something that I've been noticing a lot more in the communication that gets generated by a generative AI tool that will tend to use ambiguity in very senseless, meaningless ways, whereas I feel like the skill of ambiguity in leadership communication tends to be about how you're saying something without saying it, right? You know what I mean? Like there's a kind of dancing around something art that we're not quite ready to unpack this issue for general dissemination yet, but we need you to not worry about it, and we need to calm the troops, and we need to make sure that people are not, fomenting revolution within the ranks or whatever. Do you kind of find yourself helping leaders navigate that moment and trying to, help them unlearn what the generated text that's too broad, too ambiguous is providing?
For the most part, we're working directly, me and these leaders, on how do you draft persuasive, influential messages that hold that ambiguity in it. I'm not teaching them to rely on AI for that. AI could give them feedback, but I don't want them putting the message into AI and then saying, help me have the right level of nuance here, because I believe the context we have in our head and in our experience is far superior to what's in the AI's training data, even if it's trained on your organization's data, which is why now a lot of these AI developers are looking at how do we import context into an internal language model so that it understands that kind of nuance. So my focus is really human to human. How does a leader get inside the mind of their direct reports, their organization? Who can they talk to get a sense of what's really going on in the organization? How do I deliver a message in a way that reinforces what people are saying and feeling? How do we acknowledge the objections in their mind up front? These are nuanced, strategic discussions we have to have that I don't want to have with an AI tool. I want a leader to have it with another leader with the wisdom of lived experience, not the sum total of generalized human knowledge, but the wisdom of lived experience, and to figure out who are the strategic others on that leader's team who they have to talk to really understand what's going on in that organization. And you can't outsource that to AI.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And obviously this relates really strongly to work I've been doing and what my TEDx talk gets into and all of that. But I think there's just something so interesting about the specificity of the challenge of leadership communication that you're focused on. And one of the things that occurs to me about that specificity is that there's a difference between confidence and certainty in how a leader sounds, right? And in a world of fast-moving developments around AI and geopolitical volatility and organizational complexity, leaders are being asked to project that confidence without necessarily having the certainty. So what does that actually require of them technically as communicators?
One of my favorite quotes comes from the futurist Dr. Bob Johansen, who says, "The future will punish certainty and reward clarity." And I share that quote in one of my keynotes, my communication keynote, all the time when I talk about the importance of clarity, because for so many leaders, clarity and confidence come from subject matter expertise, from being fully prepared, from having all the information, from knowing what's coming. But you and I both know that it's going to be impossible to have complete information from this point going forward ever again. And the information that we do have will be in question, because we'll question, is it accurate? Is it a hallucination? Is it a strategic manipulation on behalf of whoever developed the AI tool? Who's controlling the alignment of the AI? So there's so much uncertainty that what I love about that quote is that it liberates us from needing to have all the answers, and it lets us find confidence in the uncertainty. So I don't have to say, I know what's coming. I can say with 100% confidence, nobody knows what's coming. Anyone who tells you they do is wrong. And it's up to all of us to go through a process to get the information we need to know so that we can get to where you want to go. And you're going to be the first person I tell when I have that information. And that's
That is
100% confidence about uncertainty.
Yeah, so that is actually, I was going to ask you as a follow-up, I don't know yet is one of the hardest things for a leader to say credibly, but I think you've already kind of answered this, but I still want to make sure I'm asking it just in case there's any additional nuance you want to provide here, which is that clarity and certainty that you're talking about there, how do I communicate clarity in the gap between what I know and what people need to hear without losing trust in the process while acknowledging that certainty is not there?
One element that I've been thinking about since we started our conversation is what's important for leaders to include that AI can't include in a message. And what builds authentic communication is vulnerability. When a leader is willing to be vulnerable about their own doubts, about what's going on, that builds trust because they're not trying to present this perfect image. So in those situations, what I'll advise a leader is to say, I can imagine what you're thinking in this moment. If I were in your position, here's what I would be thinking, and you'd be right. I've had those same doubts. And to be honest, none of us have the solution. We don't know what's going to happen. And I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review from the beginning of the pandemic on how to reassure your team when the news is scary. And I feel like that is unfortunately an evergreen article that leaders need now. And it's not about projecting confidence that it'll all work out. It's about acknowledging I don't have that information, and I will admit I'm uncomfortable with that too, because I want to know what's happening as much as you do. Here's what we know. Here's what we're doing. Here's when we'll give you an update. So when we can provide that kind of certainty of process, then I believe people feel more comfortable, they feel reassured, they feel included, and that's what builds trust.
Is there a tendency that leaders tend to have to either over-explain or under-explain in those situations? And how maybe does the presence of AI in the communication process change those tendencies?
Leaders do both. They under-explain, they over-explain. The goal is to find that productive middle, and what the productive middle is depends on the industry, depends on what's in the news that day. Is it relevant or is it not? And then it's really important that the leader bring that human element into their communication, because if there's a lot of uncertainty and the company receives what is obviously an AI-generated email, what it means is the leader doesn't know enough to write by themselves, and I'm not important enough for a personal human written message. So I believe going forward, the presence of AI in an email like this is going to signify a lack of importance, because you're not important enough for me to show up to the meeting directly. I'm going to send my AI instead. I'm going to have AI write the email instead. Now, I'll also say, having said that, within a few years, I don't think anyone is going to ask whether you used AI to write an email or a message, because of course you did. Just like, of course you used spell check before you sent a message. Of course we're going to use AI, but it will be a better AI and we'll be better at using it.
Yeah, I like the we'll be better at using it addition to that.
Hopefully,
for sure.
Some of
yeah,
us.
no, I think it's true. I'm also wanting to ask you about executive presence on camera, because a lot of these high stakes moments that we're talking about are increasingly recorded and clipped and broadcast and recontextualized. So does that change your coaching? Is a leader ever just communicating only to the room anymore, or are they always having to think about that broader communication?
The leader always has to think about who might be watching this later and what their reaction might be. And we saw that even recently. I was interviewed by the New York Times for a speech that Aaron Judge of the New York Yankees gave to Team USA for this baseball game. And And he gave this, I don't know how long it was, this speech. It wasn't the best speech. It wasn't the worst speech, but it wasn't the best speech. And a 20-second clip of that was shared online and instantly became known as the worst speech in the world, which of course it was not. It was this gross overreaction to what wasn't even a full speech. It was 20 seconds. But what it shows as is that in the room is never just in the room. But we've seen that for decades. Someone can always record something and release it to the world. So we always have to be aware of who's our audience in the room and who's our audience outside of the room who might hear our message. It doesn't mean we have to speak necessarily for the virtual audience. We just have to be prepared for that to happen. And that specific example was very frustrating to me because it was unfair and it was inaccurate as well.
Yeah, does sound very frustrating, especially for Aaron Judge. Come on.
but here's the thing, and this is what I talked about in the article. Aaron Judge is a world-class baseball player. The
Right.
moment he has the title captain, which is leader, we expect him to also be a motivational, inspirational speaker. And he wasn't. He hasn't trained his whole life to do that, like he's trained his whole life to hit a baseball. So, but the instant he has the title of leader, our expectations change as to how he should speak. And I think that's a warning for every leader, that the moment you're viewed as a leader, our expectations of your communication skills and your executive presence go through the roof, because for us, that is an example of your leadership effectiveness. Right or wrong, that's what society's expectations are.
It also seems like, the camera flattens so much of what makes someone dynamic or compelling in a room, whether it's their energy or their physicality, like just peripheral presence. And at the same time, leaders are now being watched at closer range than ever before. So what gets lost in that translation, and maybe what also gets gained in that?
It's interesting when you ask about what gets gained. What gets gained is the ability to reach more people than you could just in that small room, especially if you're an international organization with a lot of different locations that can't all fly into the New York office or the Miami office. So the exposure is broadened. The challenge is, as you've said, the camera can cut off our energy. It doesn't have to. And I spend a lot of time helping leaders deliver their on-camera presence, the way they look into the camera lens, the intensity and intention in their voice, their body language. I teach them to stand up when they're delivering a virtual presentation, because we're not getting energy from our audience like we would if we were in person. So we have to manufacture that energy in order to then deliver it through a camera lens. And that's why it's so fatiguing to be on camera. And so by standing up, by letting ourselves use our gestures, by keeping our head and torso in the frame, there are techniques we can use to make sure we come across in a powerful way, just like we would in person. But it's a separate skill set that we have to focus on.
Yeah, I think it's a really good opportunity to explore it. So, because there's enormous pressure on leaders to project authority on camera, but a lot of coaching for that ends up producing a kind of performance of authority rather than the real thing. And you're navigating that distinction in what you're talking about here, but I wonder how else might you suggest for people to navigate that distinction and bring a sense of authority to how they're coming across on camera?
So what makes up our authority? I'm going to move. Having a tall posture gives us authority. Confidence gives us authority. Eye contact gives us authority. But on camera, if I look down at your image, now I'm breaking the eye contact. So the funny thing is I have to do something so unnatural, look into a camera lens, in order to appear natural to my audience. So
when there's a face right there that you could be looking at, right?
There's a face right here. And anyone who's done on-camera training, you're looking into the microphone or into the camera, and sometimes you can see yourself below, but you can't actually look at yourself.
Yeah.
So these are competencies we build. And then using the why you question, the technique, the language that we create can then bring out our authenticity. And that's in person or virtually. If we can have bullet points with authentic, powerful, real language, that's going to let us be more powerful, which is going to build our authority when we're on camera.
How about a twist on this? How do you coach leaders whose warmth and informality is their actual strength, but who feel pressure to perform a more polished, like executive version of themselves, especially when AI tools or just kind of online distribution tends to optimize toward that more polished register?
It's about the language that they're using. So very often people who over-prepare will come across as scripted. That's why I don't want you to write it out word for word. I want you to have bullet points. And I want those bullet points to be language that's easy for you to say. For example, one executive I was working with yesterday says her team presents these bullet points for her to use when she's speaking on a panel. Nobody's ever read them out loud. They just give them to her and she looks at them. She goes through it in her mind and then she speaks. And guess what? They're hard to say. They're too polished. And she is a very confident and authentic speaker, but she's not setting herself up for success. So we talked about having her team prepare bullet points, not sentences, read them out loud before they give them to her, make sure they're written for the ear, not the eye. And then as part of her preparation process, she needs to read them out loud to make sure they're in her voice.
That's fantastic and very helpful, I imagine, for many of our listeners. I want to talk really quickly about, you have a concept called the anti-pitch idea. And I want to ask about, that's running against a lot of what, AI powered sales and outreach tools are really designed to do, like personalize at scale, optimize conversion, and reduce friction in the ask. Where does your philosophy land in direct tension with where technology is pushing us? And what is this idea?
The anti-pitch is based on the fact that early in my career, I was teaching the elevator pitch, and the more I taught it, the more I hated it. because it's inauthentic, it's ineffective, it sounds salesy, and finally I thought, what's the best way to introduce yourself? And I started experimenting, and I live in Washington, D.C., where we network for a living. I mean, we bring business cards to the gym, and we give them out at the gym. I mean, it's an effective place to network in D.C. And so I thought, well, what's a better way to do this? Instead of a pitch, let's come up with a conversation starter. I have a background in, and I'm currently. I call it going from B to C. Hi, my name is Allison Shapira. I have a background in opera, and I'm currently helping people find their voice or helping people reclaim their voice so people will actually believe what they have to say. And I experimented with that and realized it was a much easier way to introduce yourself. Then I realized when I was teaching it at conferences, in every panel after my keynote, everyone would introduce themselves using the anti-pitch, and it was so exciting. So it takes what's important to you, front loads it, so that the other person that you're speaking to can easily absorb it. And I've actually built a GPT trained on the anti-pitch that helps people come up with it. I don't think that AI tools right now will naturally give you that same level of I would say authenticity when developing it, but I do believe AI tools can help you streamline your anti-pitch, because for most of us, our pitch is too wordy, it's too verbose, it's too salesy, and so an AI tool can help us with the structure of it.
I love that. That's so great. I'm going to be practicing mine because mine definitely has something to do with being a linguist by education and then finding myself in this, human-mediated world or tech-mediated human world where language, especially now, language has so much to do with everything that we're talking about.
That's right. And now you have a background in linguistics, and now you're translating between AI and humanity.
100%.
You have so much to play with there.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the opening chapter of what matters next. Well, I want to ask you about the ethical use of AI in relationship building, because what you're describing is fantastic, and then using these tools to help kind of get clarity around how you articulate these things, that's really helpful. But what is in your mind, the ethical use of these tools in relationship building? What does that look like? Not maybe as this kind of abstract principle, but more like a daily practice for a leader who's genuinely trying to connect with other people and with their reports and with the leaders they connect with, without necessarily just transacting or without doing it in a kind of rote way.
One of the ethical ways in which we use AI is by being open about when we're using AI. So there are interesting studies showing people are afraid to disclose they're using it and showing that they are judged more harshly for using it. So I'll give you an example. I was having a difficult conversation with someone who I collaborate with, and both of us said to each other, we're going to use AI to help us prepare for this conversation, because I want to make sure that everything we're talking about, I'm saying it in the best possible way. And we brainstormed, each of us using AI on our own, and we came to the conversation with a much more powerful, trust-building foundation, because we were open that we were using AI to make sure the best part of us showed up.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. Where I struggle with AI and ethics is not in individuals' use of it, because I believe we've talked about that. How do you use it so that it maintains your voice?
Mm-hmm.
My primary concern is in the underlying values that are being programmed into these models, because those are subtly affecting our own voice when we use these tools. And I'm intentional about which language models I use and which ones I don't, based on what I understand about the values baked into them. I don't think enough leaders understand that. And I don't think enough leaders are asking, as they integrate AI into their organization, how are we choosing language models that are built with values we appreciate, as opposed to values that we don't ascribe to, that are now subtly manipulating our behavior. And that is actually one of my biggest fears, is the alignment of AI systems and how those tools are then used to manipulate the behavior of others without their consent.
Sing it, sister.
Which is a whole other podcast episode.
Oh yeah, well we got plenty of those, so we'll just refer some of those discussions to the existing ones we have. But what I would love to ask you for starting to close here, starting to wrap up these ideas, we've talked a little bit about what you would like leaders to stop doing with AI right now. I would like to know what you would like leaders to start doing that most of them haven't tried yet.
I'd like you to, first and foremost, take a message that you're going to deliver, put it into whatever AI tool you're using, and ask it to identify the jargon. Because very often you're using it without even realizing it, and it's reducing the power and presence of your words. So that's an easy first step for using AI to bring out your authenticity. I would then like leaders to be intentional about teaching their AI tools what their values are. We think about what's authentic to us, but we never put it in writing. We never actually come up with a "this I believe" statement. And if leaders would take that time to do it, then we can make sure, as we scale our voice, we're scaling the best of our voice, as opposed to just scaling whatever comes out in our writing. And so that's where I'm guiding leaders right now, to be intentional about what they want their voice to be, and then teaching the AI what their voice is, so that then AI can reflect their voice back to them.
Well, again, sing it, sister. You must be a singer because you're singing my song. Allison, what a fantastic conversation this has been. I know we're going to provide some resources for folks to be able to find you, find your book, find other resources. Any last thoughts you want to leave with our listeners? Anything you want them to think about trying this week? What if people want to lead authentically in an AI-shaped world and they were just to take one first step this week, is there something that you would tell them to do?
I would tell them to take an AI tool, whether it's a language model, whether it's ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, Gemini, and describe a challenge they're facing and ask AI, how can AI help me with this? I think we don't use AI enough to help us consider how to best use AI. That's the first step that I would recommend for people who aren't already using it. That's where I would start. I encourage people to visit my website and also to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post frequently about the latest research in AI and authenticity, and as my own thoughts evolve, because right now we're all writing the new rules of leadership, and I want to make sure we write them in a way that keeps our humanity front and center. And I encourage others to join me on that journey.
All right. Well, Allison, what a great discussion this has been. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Kate. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everything you do.
Thank you for listening to The Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interabang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to The Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.